In the spirit of things that we obviously see during times of crisis, it's very easy to see that, and people see that and interact with your company that way. But can you think of a time and an example where you did the right thing because you found an opportunity that you wanted to be able to act on for a particular population of people?
Sure. So I think you're referring to the work that we've done with the disability community, and I'd submit to you it is definitely an example of us doing the right thing, but it is also an example of good business, and let me explain why. So in the early days of the wireless industry, if you thought about when we were essentially at that point, we were just providing a communication service, right? And there were no such things as smartphones, and so people weren't surfing the internet, or they weren't texting, or these other things. They wanted to talk, so they wanted to be able to speak, and they wanted to be able to hear. That business model left many people sort of on the sidelines. I mean, if you're a person with a hearing disability, or if you're unable to speak, you weren't able to participate in that model. And it was sort of stupid of us to try and continue to sell sort of voice services to people that couldn't speak or people that couldn't hear. So through some of our stakeholder management, as we engaged with that community, we got a better understanding as to what their requirements are. And lo and behold, I mean, this is really just common sense, right? And as this was actually a way to innovate with some of the technology. So if you're thinking, if you are not able to speak, how are you going to be able to use a wireless device? Well, lo and behold, once texting comes along, right, there's a way, to give a voice to someone that doesn't have an actual voice. And as we started to change some of our plans to fine-tune to what someone could actually use, it created some innovations. And some of those services we found had more mainstream applicability, right? They were more applicable, to people that didn't have a perceived disability. So, you may recall. So, for example, for people that in the texting world, there was sort of text to speech. If you couldn't see the text, it was useless to you. But if the device could speak, that text message to you, so that was incredibly powerful for someone that couldn't see. But we were also finding that there were people that, purportedly didn't have a disability that wanted some of those services as well. So we were able to come up with different plans that not only, generated new revenue streams for us and created some very loyal customers amongst the disability community, but also, provided them with value and enabled them to sort of participate in these new communications mediums. So that was one of our first examples of shared success, if you will.
And so I would say social innovation, because I always use Verizon as the example of that your philanthropy and your incredible connections and understanding of a broad set of stakeholders actually helped you innovate and move something from something that could seemingly seem like the nice thing to do to actually a new market and a new opportunity for Verizon. So I think it's such a great example whereby the role that you play and the role that others play in this space of corporate social responsibility and social innovation, you actually have a view into lots of different societal issues that the business doesn't necessarily know about. You become possibly market makers for your industry. So I think that's such a great example.
Yeah, or incubators, right?
Or incubators,
that was the sort of the original formulation of shared success was an incubation model. Our goal was, and we looked at 3 areas. We looked at education, we looked at the environment, and we looked at healthcare. And we wanted to very strategically do some stakeholder inquiry to learn what were the issues in those communities, what are the technologies that potentially could be of value there, and then how do we bring that back to the business so that it could create products and services. So, I mean, again, we're a for-profit enterprise, right?
Right.
So they want to figure out how to mine that so that we could make money, but also in the classic Porter shared value sense, right? It's about creating, doing it in a valued sort of way.
Right.
The thing that keeps me at Verizon, what I'm most excited about, and actually sort of started thinking about this almost 20 years ago, was you hear a lot of conversation today talking about smart solutions, right? There's smart transportation systems, there's smart agriculture, there's a smart agriculture system, there's a smart energy system, there are smart communities. What I think is really cool about what we do is we can legitimately say that wireless technology enables the smart in virtually all of these solutions. So we call this the Internet of Things. That may not mean a lot to the average consumer, but it's this notion that I think actually Tom Friedman captured this really well. He talked about you can make anything smarter by connecting it to the internet, because now you can. It almost becomes a living organism that can provide you information that you can mine to make things more efficient. So one of the examples, one of the smart areas that we're playing in are these smart communities. Actually, Boston is a smart community. Sacramento, California is a smart community. And one of the examples that we're playing with these communities on is around, how do you eliminate traffic congestion in a city? It has, incredible benefits. Just, if you think about like from on one level, how do you improve the livability of a city? Getting people where they need to go on time with less congestion, reducing the amount of pollution. You can improve air quality and so forth. So we have, like, for example, in downtown Boston, we're working with the Boston Department of Transportation on one intersection that we've wired up. And what do I mean by wired up? Well, it's the intersection of Mass Ave and Commonwealth Avenue, right? Mm-hmm. So a big four-way intersection. Think about it every day. You got trucks rumbling through there. You have cars, you have pedestrians, and now you have people on bikes. Right? This is a recipe for disaster, right? Obviously, if they all show up at the same time. So we've wired it up to not only provide cameras that can, provide real-time visual information, but we've created what we call smart asphalt. Well, I mean, asphalt itself is not smart. What is smart is that there are sensors that are embedded in the road. So as a vehicle passes, it can send information to say, hey, that was a pretty big truck that just rumbled by, or that seemed like a passenger car, or that was a bicycle, right? And in the world of data analytics, right, what happens is you can take the data around vehicle traffic, right, from these smart asphalt sensors. You can take the visuals, right, the video from the camera, and you got a big data set, and you can run algorithms against it and help a planner decide how do I time the lights in that intersection to reduce congestion? What would happen if I decided to put a dedicated bike lane in to move the bicycles out of the middle of the intersection off to the side? What we found is that most traffic planners they sort of relied on these generic models that didn't have specific data that was relevant to a particular intersection that they're dealing with. Our technology, right? So it's the connectivity that gathers the data. It's a cloud, right? And all the cloud means is that you take all this data and you create a big data set that can be, run on a computer, and now the planner, can run some queries against that database and say, how could I change the traffic flow going through this intersection to make it safer, to make it less congested, to reduce pollution, and keep the traffic moving? This is really cool stuff, right? I mean, this is shared success. If every city in the country wants to do this, we're going to make a boatload of money, right? We're not bashful about that. But we're doing it in a way that just think of the value that it delivers to the community. Yeah. So So that's why, the Internet of Things and these smart technologies, I mean, I could talk to you all day about smart agriculture, smart transportation. There are things, we're doing with pharmaceutical and the food industry to track food, using sensors, track food and drugs to make sure they, A, get to where they're supposed to be, and B, they get there safely without spoilage kinds of things. This is a tremendous business opportunity for us.
That's fantastic. One question I have for you, just because we're sitting and talking, in terms of the stakeholders that can input to that data collection, can you collect? I know you can collect from the sensors, you can collect from the videos. Can you actually collect from the user themselves around how they feel about what it's like for them to be traveling? So is there any input through smartphones, if they're connected to Verizon, that they can actually give you data that it's truly the sort of human-centric, customer-centric design that you get to see, and you get the sensors, but do you get the human experience that they could add to your data set?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. I am not aware of whether we've done any sort of commuter surveying, but what I can tell you, and what you probably know, right? All these GPS apps that you have on your phone, whether it's Google Maps or the Apple version or Waze, right? They're all relying on data that is gathered in the aggregate,
right,
and anonymized from cell phones, right?
Right.
So in that cell phone, there is a sensor that indicates when it is moving, right? So you can detect when it's in a car, and that's how, so when you look at Google Maps and you see that the road looks green ahead or the road looks red ahead, I mean, the way that data is coming from cell phones that are people have in their vehicles as they're driving along. So there's that real-time feedback, so you know what's happening, and that's right. I mean, that's some of it with respect to traffic flow. That's another data set that you would look at if you were the transportation planner trying to figure out how do I time the lights, right? I can see, as these vehicles are moving down the street, right? Maybe I need to speed this light up, or maybe I need to slow down some lights on a side street, kind of thing. So.
Great.
I mean,
Such a great example.
Yeah, it is. I mean, virtually anything, right? I mean, you can put a sensor in anything that you want, and you just need to figure out why would I want to do that? How is that data relevant to an issue that I'm trying to address, and how would I use it?
So let's shift topics and to communications.
Okay.
And one of the things we talked about is that Verizon has been publishing a social report for a good long time now. You've got 14 reports. And so you must have seen a lot of change in terms of what that report is like to produce inside, the expectations, who's reading it. So what are some of the key changes you'd say?
Well, I think the most visible one is when I did my first one, I didn't have any gray hair. Look at me now.
Which is actually, nothing to, you should be celebrated because you've been consistently doing it, and there's something to be said for that, because you've almost grown up with the field in terms of what was expected before and now. So I think you deserve to be in some Hall of Fame, because I don't know anyone other than a consulting firm that's paid a lot of money to do this, anyone inside of a company who has been reporting for this long.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Kudos.
Well, thank you. Sometimes it seems like more of a cross to bear. But so Ken, I think in answer to your question, like 14 years ago, we were trying to be all things to all people, and really it wasn't very focused. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what was relevant to people. And it was more, we had actually the impetus for Verizon to start to report was we have a group that we call our Consumer Advisory Panel. These are stakeholders that represent a lot of national interest groups. It could be civil rights groups, business groups, small business groups, and so forth. And they knew a lot about what Verizon did. They knew about some of our philanthropy and other things, and they were encouraging us to communicate because it wasn't well known to customers, and they thought it would be of value to us. So that's sort of how we started. And I mean, I remember at that point it was just like it was just me, right? And I had a consultant that could help, and I literally just like tried to talk to everybody I could in the business and find out anything that seemed like It was benefiting the community. And I had just this ocean of material. I really didn't know who we were trying to communicate it to, what was of interest to them. There weren't a lot of metrics associated with it. It was like a lot of stories. It was mostly storytelling at that point, and that's how we started off. I would like to think that over the past 13 years that we've been able to refine this. We've refined the audience. I mean, a corporate social responsibility report is not really a consumer piece. I don't know of many consumers that are, unless they have insomnia, want to sit down and read through that.
True.
It's very much focused on the investment community. I mean, it was originally the socially responsible investors. Now it's increasingly becoming the mainstream ones, like the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world, and also very much on enterprise business customers, because they want to do business with companies that share their values. And the last piece would be policymakers. Actually, when I started the work, I was part of the policy shop in Washington, and our corporate responsibility strategy and work was very much a part of our policy initiatives, right? We wanted to make sure that the policymakers understood, what our values were, what our mission was, how we were helping them meet their goals, and, obviously then, there was advocacy going on around particular policy issues. I think one of the other big things in reporting that wasn't there before is it's metrics driven. We've been able to come up with those measures that we think are relevant to our business and to the communities we serve, and the report actually helps us internally get the business focused on that. So when we started off 14 years ago, we didn't have environmental goals like a carbon intensity goal. We didn't have some goals around diversity and inclusion. And over the years, we've added data that shows like our diversity profile, our employee profile, which, right? I mean, income equality is the diversity of your workforce, right, are very prominent issues. So that's you see more of that and more specificity now than you saw 14 years ago.
And so it becomes a big internal tool as well. Because 14 years ago when you asked for this data set, we don't measure that. No one does, and so now you do, and it's in there. So everybody looks for it that way. So internally, it sounds like it's helped a lot too.
Yes, it's helped to get things aligned. And I think the other big tool that we have talked about to help sort of refine your message is this notion of doing a materiality assessment with your stakeholders. What I find with the report, like the first reports were very long, right? Like over 100 pages, and no one wants to read that. Never mind the consumers, right? There's just too much information there. And the investors in particular will tell you there are certain things that they're just not interested in. If you go through a materiality process, it's a great strategy tool because it tells you we just completed one this summer. So the 4 top issues that came out for us were, not surprisingly, privacy and data security is the number one issue across all the stakeholders we speak with. So those include consumers, they include business customers and policymakers and NGOs. Everybody in the world is worried about their online presence and how that information is being managed. The second issue that popped, again, not surprisingly, was they want to understand more of how our technology can deliver solutions to some of the social challenges that communities are facing, really. So a lot of this is the IoT message. Diversity and inclusion. I mean, it's a particular issue in the tech industry, right? Want to make sure that both men and women are getting opportunity, that there's ethnic diversity as well. And then the fourth issue was the one of the digital divide. The good problem that we have is that everyone recognizes that our technology is essential to really being relevant in the world, right? And having opportunity. Mm-hmm. If you don't have high-speed internet, right, you're going to be left behind. So those were the 4 issues. That's what our report is going to focus on, right? I mean, and that's quite frankly what our strategy is going to focus on. So it helps solve the problem that we had 14 years ago, trying to figure out, well, what are the most important issues and what should we be communicating about? I don't have that issue anymore, right?
Right.
I can sort of push everything else. I mean, look, you still have to talk. I mean, people want to know that, you have an environment, right? You're expected, if you're a Fortune company, and to be a good corporate citizen, right, you got to care about the environment. You got to have good supply chain due diligence. You got to have human rights programs. You got to have product responsibility. There are some certain things that you have to do, and if people discover that you don't do those well, then everything else becomes suspect. So you have a little bit of that in the report so that people understand that's there. And our strategy has been, we're not going to sort of regurgitate that in every report. All that's on our website. If you really are interested in it, you can go read about it there. The tools that we provide to parents so that they can create a safe environment for their children. That's all on the website. What you'll see the report focus on is, privacy and the solutions that we're creating and the digital divide and diversity and inclusion, those kinds of things.
That's great. Great. As you talk about it's gotten more focused, right? That we have a better sense of who's reading it, and so we get a better sense of what to put in it. And I would expect the demands get higher too. So I'm curious, is there anything over those 14 years in terms of content that goes in there that you now, and then under the heading of transparency, that you now talk about that you never would have talked about before as the game has changed? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, I think so. For me, the biggest piece is 14. A decade ago, the conversation was all about risk, right? So if you were an investor, especially, or if you were an enterprise customer, what you were worried about is if you were investing in or partnering with Verizon, were we doing something that could blow up in their face, right? And cause the stock to plummet, right? Or make us a partner in a supply chain that would be really embarrassing, right? So that is what a lot of the reporting was focused on. What I think is, as companies have become more sophisticated, right? I mean, you still have to have your fundamentals to address that risk. It gives you the license to talk more about the opportunity associated with your technology. And that's what investors in particular are looking for. Because especially in our business where you've got a sort of a personal mobile device market that's near saturation. I mean, how many phones and iPads and so forth can one person carry, right? Where we're looking for growth, that's what the investor wants to understand. And that's where we can start to talk about some of these smart solutions, right? That's where our growth is going to come from. So the report has morphed in that sense. It helps people understand, where we're going. And quite frankly, for me, that growth is infinite, right? Because there are two things that happened that made that really easy for us, right? You got the Paris Accord that said that climate is, one of the top issues that society faces. And then shortly thereafter, you have the UN coming out with these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Well, wow, this is great. So for me, it's like the world has spoken. Here are all the challenges. If you can figure out how to address those challenges, you're going to make a lot of money, right? And that's what we can start to focus on and talk about that, and that's what people want to hear. So
That's great.
I think that's a big difference than if you went back and looked at what we were saying in 2004.
So looking more at the opportunities to solve social problems. One of the important issues is you say, what used to be in it, what shouldn't be in it, and so no one knew. And so one of the things that's happened in the field is there are some standards out there. And so if Verizon's made a choice about how to approach those standards, we'd love to hear a little bit more about that choice, please.
Okay. So I think in addition to a materiality assessment, which helps you identify what you should be reporting on, I do agree with you. I think the standards, whether it's the GRI, the CDP, right, these all, for me, identify expectations in society, right? What issues do people think are relevant for a business? And they can provide a good guide as to what you should be communicating. My pet peeve has always been most of those standards are focused on manufacturers, right? They don't necessarily address a service industry like ours, right? You think about, we don't make the iPhone. We don't make Android phones. We don't make anything, right? We provide a service. We provide the connectivity. that's fundamentally different, and the corporate responsibility issues you have as a service provider are different than, if you're you're an extractives company and you're mining something out of the ground, or you're manufacturing, and using resources to do that. Obviously, we use resources as well, but it's less intensive. So for me, between a materiality assessment, what GRI says is relevant, what SASB's thinking about, what CDP thinks about, what we hear, and we work very closely with the investor relations group, and anytime any question that remotely addresses corporate responsibility comes up, they call us, right? To come in. All of those conversations and all of those standards and so forth, for me, help identify what the expectations are going forward, and each year that helps inform what we report on. But I guess I'm just sort of that dogmatic. No investor has ever said to me, I'm not going to invest in Verizon because you guys don't report on the GRI standard. So there are elements there that are relevant. I'm going to use them because they define a relevant expectation of us. But so do other conversations and other standards.
You mentioned 14 years in, you've come away with a lot of lessons and a few more gray hairs. So if you were talking to someone who was early in the early stages of putting together a report, what advice would you give them?
Delegate?
Well, have a good team, right? Have a good team. I would say, I think like the materiality process itself can really help shape what you do, and take a lot of the ambiguity around it, right? I mean, 14 years ago, the field was nascent, right? What was this report? I had no idea what should be in and what shouldn't be in, right? But if you go through a materiality process, right, it includes senior executives internal to your business, because you want to understand from their perspective what they think defines business success, as well as all of your stakeholders. It gives you a pretty clear roadmap as to what you should be focused on, what's relevant and what's not relevant. So I would very much start there.
Some, if not many, of the people taking this course from around the world may be at various stages, at the beginning, at the middle, or as seasoned as you are. It seems like it's the cutting edge of common sense to do all of this shared success, that when a business pays attention and meets and exceeds all of its stakeholder expectations, you have a successful business. But it's not easy, and it's not as easy even as other departments. We talk a lot about that you have to manage it like any other business unit, but it's highly relational. It's managing lots of different issues. So we've heard a lot about your process and around stakeholder engagement communication, but it's a challenge. What are some of the challenges? And you've been in this field since almost the very, very beginning. What have you seen as the increase in the challenge as the good news and the bad news? The challenge is more people are paying attention. It's a board issue where it wasn't many years ago, and it's a business issue. So what are those challenges, and what can people expect in terms of not getting discouraged and pushing that ball up the hill?
Yeah. So I think one of the big challenges I see is there's a communications challenge. What was interesting is if you look at most of the advertising that we do, it's very traditional, very product service oriented, right? Because that is what has been successful in the past. And I mean, I feel for my colleagues that are on, that are in Verizon Wireless, or they're on the FiOS side of the business, right? They've got very aggressive numbers that they have to meet each quarter. And, if I were sitting in their seat, they're thinking, well, I need more advertising, right? I need more people to be familiar with the product and what it does so that more people want to buy it, right? The challenge that we have is, when we started with this We Need More campaign this year, we got a very small slice of the marketing budget and the media time that is traditionally focused on product and service. And what we found is when people went back and looked at that the consumer sentiment associated with those ads around we need more in the education work and so forth was off the charts. The best of anything that we've ever done, right? The concern of the person that's got that profit and loss responsibility is that many of them see that as sort of that's taking away from their ability to meet their number. So there's that tension there. How do you demonstrate that, if people understand that we're active on some of these social issues, that's going to accrue value to the brand, and that is going to create more sales and so forth. I think our challenge is, it's a frustration, right? You can get frustrated about it, but I think at the end of the day, what you need to try and do is figure out how can you are there some numbers, some metrics that you can mine out of this to go back and demonstrate that there is business value, profit value associated with this? We're not there yet, so
Right.
that's on us, right? We got to continue to sort of look at that and try and figure out a way that we can communicate in their language, right? The language of the business. I can't come in and talk about. I find it curious, like when I use the word sustainability, with people that are not part of our group, there could be 50 different definitions as to what that means. That's not a term that they commonly use. So it's sort of incumbent on us to come in and use metrics and speak in language that they relate to, because after all, they're the ones that are actually selling our product and service in the most tangible way.
Well, so what's interesting about that is, having been in the field a long time, years ago, the biggest challenge of communication was for some of the pressure groups and activist groups from the outside in. Today, I think companies do a great job on that side. What you're saying is almost the biggest challenge is really trying to communicate internally this value, that your internal stakeholders and how to really, just because you have a mandate from the top down and this is important and you get money to do it does not mean it's going to be easy, that you
Right.
actually have,
Yep.
that's just the beginning. Then now you have to actually go and educate internally.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Very much so. Right. And maybe this is another opportunity where sort of Babson can help fill the void. If you think of the traditional business education, this hasn't been a component
Right.
in mainstream. Right. People don't. Right. They think, well, business is business, and then corporate responsibility is, well, that's your philanthropy,
Right.
but that's sort of separate. I believe we're moving to, I think this is where Porter's going, right? Shared value is really capitalism 2.0,
Right.
It is so what you do and how you do it are both equally
That's right.
important.
So you mentioned a couple of times it's hard, and you used the word frustrating. So I'm curious. I'm sure you had wonderful days in your career, and a couple more than a handful of very hard days. And so, don't mean to put you on the spot, but any of those hard days, those tough moments you would recall at this point, you want to share?
Yeah, I think, not to name names, but, we talked a little bit about reporting. Each year we try to add something new, try to be more transparent and address some emerging expectations. On more than one occasion, literally the day that we were looking to release the report, having sort of an officer come to you and say, I never agreed that data could be included in the report. That's caused me a lot of frustration over time, and in some cases have been able to keep it in, and in other cases had to remove it and felt sort of really, almost like violated, right? It's like it's a broken trust. That's really frustrating. That's
a hard day.
Yeah, that's a real hard day.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
part of what we
Thank
wanted to do is give folks a perspective of the real, like you said, an unvarnished version. So
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I think as we move the journey from corporate social responsibility to corporate social innovation, I would say the one distinction, although it's always been there, but hasn't had the structures to be able to do it, is that you really can be, for your internal stakeholders, a solutions provider, because you really are, the notion of boundary spanning. You spend a lot of time looking at problems on the outside. You clearly know what's going on the inside because you couldn't do your job if you didn't. So you know more about what's going on inside than most people because they're in silos doing what they're doing. And you are a boundary spanner. You need to actually be a translator. And by being that boundary spanner, over time, you will probably be a more effective, and this role is more effective as a solutions provider to the business, not just managing risk, but to the business opportunities. So I think the promise of social innovation is that, yes, while philanthropy is really good, and while you've got to comply to all the regulations, I think having a role like this, and particularly how effectively you've done it, is you actually do become an effective partner and solutions provider for the business.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think another thing that is making it easier is, Ken, you talked about expectations, and if you think of millennials and what their expectations are, they are really changing what businesses need to do. Their expectations are sort of through the roof, right? It's no longer, it can't be the business of business is just business. They expect that, you're active on social issues. They may not always agree with what you're doing, but they want you to be part of the community. They want you to be part of that solution. And I think, I was reading something recently. I think it was a PwC study that said that they were polling CEOs, and almost 50% of them were saying within the next 5 years it is going to be an imperative that a company be engaged on some of these, whether it's education or equality or immigration. I mean, you name the issue. If you are not involved with that, I mean, you're going to lose customers because they will think that you're just acting in your own self-interest, and you're gonna lose potential employees as well. Whether they're existing or people you're trying to recruit, because they want to work with someone that has similar values. That's important, and I think that's also quite different than it was 14 years ago. I mean, it was, you could legitimately just be quiet, and no one, there wasn't an expectation that you were going to talk about climate issues and whether it was right for us to withdraw from the Paris Accord, right?
Well, I just came back from Net Impact, which is a large, is an organization. There were about 2,000 MBAs, business students, and the entire theme of the conference was on purpose. And that's becoming a language now that, and I think it is PwC that's done some research with CEOs and leadership around the whole notion of purpose, and different from the purpose we talked about here, but that how to actually tap into the purpose of your employees in a way that actually accelerates and amplifies all these kinds of issues. So purpose is a big word out there that is now inside of companies. Those words weren't inside of companies 25, 30 years ago. They were soft. Right now, they're the hard stuff, is how do I activate and help people come to work purposeful, and what is their purpose, and how do we help them actually use that purpose in the benefit of the business. So.
We asked you a question about the hard days, so we should also would love to hear a little bit about maybe some of the better days. What's a great day in your career about advancing this whole idea? What comes to mind?
I think actually right now, I mentioned to you we're working on some big goals. And what's been very rewarding to me is the approach that we're taking is at the VP level across our business. There were a group of people that indicated that they wanted in on this. They thought these issues were important, and they wanted to help advance the business forward. So we're working collaboratively. I mean, it's a bit of a skunk works, right? It's not as if anyone, I mean, no one told us that we were supposed to do this, right? It wasn't an edict from the, you know, our leadership council kind of thing. And what we want to do is, and it's a bit bottom up, go to that leadership council and say, we think, this is what we think we should be communicating to the world, right? Around, I mean, it builds off this notion of, you know, we deliver the promise of the digital world. Well, let's define that a little bit more, and let's put some concrete numbers, measures around that. So I'm really, it's been a lot of fun to see how this comes together. It has frustration associated with it as well.
Sure.
But, you know, to be able to, I guess the sort of the satisfaction to be able to sit back and say that I helped move this forward, right? That's
great.
that's a good day.
That's
That's
fantastic.
a good day, you know.
A few years ago, you partnered with Babson and IO Sustainability and the Campbell Soup Company and supported us in looking at the return on investment of social and environmental programs, and primarily to be able to help CFOs understand what is that return on investment, not just, you know, how much money are we giving away of our philanthropy and who we're serving, but what is that return? And, you know, there were 4 things that we came up with, and that is, if you're social environment, you know, we understood that there is definitely a return, but in order to get that return, you had to have your programs, you know, fit your corporate culture and strategy. You needed to commit the same resources you do to any other business. You needed to manage it like you would any other business unit, and you needed to communicate it across the company. And we had an offline conversation just before around some things that you're already finding in terms of correlations. Could you speak to that? I'd love to hear.
Sure. So I mean, I think, right, in a world of sort of limited resources, within our company, I mean, we're competing for budget, we're competing for headcount, just like the operation that rolls out FiOS service in Boston kind of thing, right? So they make money. We have to be able to demonstrate that we're delivering some value back to the brand as well. So what we've started to do is the marketing team has a number of consumer-facing metrics that they look at. They have what they call their brand tracker, where they're talking to our customers to understand how much they trust us, the value that they perceive in the services that they're receiving from us. They also have this net promoter, right? You know, which seems to be in vogue. So what we've started to do is say, okay, right, if, you know, the business is really focused on, you know, we know people, right? I mean, if I said before that privacy and data security are the number one corporate responsibility issues, well, they're the number one business issues, right? I mean, if people feel that they can't trust us, that their data is not secure, they're not going to place their business with us. So that's a really important metric for the business. And then this value is, right, that, you know, am I getting, you know, sufficient value from what I'm paying for the services I'm buying from you? So what we did is we asked them to add some questions to the consumer conversation around some indicators around corporate citizenship, right? You know, do you perceive us to be a good corporate citizen? You know, do you perceive us to be doing responsible things in your community? And we're comparing sort of the consumer response with respect to those corporate citizenship questions against the trust and the value questions that are being asked. And what we're finding is, you know, something that we intuitively knew, but we never really were able to have data to demonstrate it, is that the correlation between trust and value and a good corporate citizen is the R squared on that is almost 1. I mean, it's incredibly high, right? I mean, it's not causation. I wish I could be able to say, hey, we rolled out this We Need More campaign, and now all of a sudden our trust number just shot, right? It's not, I mean, obviously we'd love to go there. We'll still, you know, look at the data and figure it out, but we are seeing an incredibly strong correlation between people that, you know about, I mean, the challenge is, you know, you talked about communication, right? not everybody knows what we're doing, right? How do you let people know, that we're really invested in education and that we're helping, these underserved middle school students get on a path, to economic opportunity? Not everybody knows, not everybody wants to know, right? But, we think that if they understand that helps on these hardcore business metrics. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, not only does it make, obviously we can demonstrate our impact, it makes us feel good, but then we get more resources, so we can do more stuff, right? We get more money, we get more people, we can create more value, so.
And I think it does speak to the outcomes of that report, because you do manage it well. You manage it like a core asset. You commit to it like a core asset. And you're going to see the results like you would any other investment in the company. So that's great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we still operate in a business, right? So all those rules, right? They still pertain.
They matter, yeah.
They do.
And so, keeping with the theme of innovation, I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the specific programs you have in support of a particular cause, education, where you see a lot of folks from the corporate world trying to make a difference, and it seems like Verizon has made a choice about how you can contribute there. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the programs you have in education, please?
Sure. So I would characterize our education programs as this is our strategic philanthropy. So strategic in the sense that, I mean, it's not totally altruistic. Obviously, we're very concerned about the education system here in the country. Is it generating young people that have the skills to be successful in an information economy? Is it generating people that are going to want to subscribe to our services, right? Is it generating people that are going to have the skills to work in our company? So it's strategic in that sense, right? In that, we see value coming out of it. But in the education space, what we wanted to do, what we saw when we started to look at this field was that you had a lot of companies that were writing grants and providing technology that could be used in the classroom. So it seemed as if there was plenty of money to buy devices. What we saw, what was missing was, how do you actually integrate that device into the curriculum? How do you help the teacher, right, change the way that they're teaching so that becomes more integrated? And that was where we found a sweet spot and where we decided we wanted to play. So we did a couple of things based on our analysis of the issues. We decided, we wanted to be at the middle school level, because the research was showing us that's really sort of the decisive time. If you can get to students at that point in time, you can help them, put them on a path, right, where they're going to have sort of economic opportunity versus it could be foreclosed at that level. So we wanted to start there, which I think is a little different than some companies and could help us differentiate, because a lot were at the high school level. We wanted to sort of get ahead of that. And then the next thing is, Cheryl always talks about the importance of partnerships, right? No one knows Verizon, isn't it? We're not an education company. So we decided to partner with a national nonprofit called Digital Promise, and one of their skill sets was around professional development. So we knew that the teachers really needed help. We needed to build a curriculum to help them understand how to use the technology, and there also needed to be some support in the schools. The schools that we work with have tech coaches, right? So they're there specifically to support the teachers as they're beginning to integrate this technology, and they're a resource that they can draw upon. So that's what our model is. We're going to underserved middle school students that don't have the resources. We are providing the teachers with the professional development. The students get, about 25% of our students did not previously have access to the internet, so they get a device along with a 2-year data plan that they can use 24/7, so they can take it home, so that they can do homework. And, we're focused on, we want to put them on the path to be thinking about either moving on towards a college degree or becoming an entrepreneur, right? So that they have a path to economic opportunity and can be successful, have the relevant skills that are required to be successful in an information economy.
What I also love about that is, and not to do an ad, but I have seen some of your ads that are pretty powerful in terms of even changing the narrative and dialogue with young people, urban youth, around what is possible for them, that it isn't just typically sports, it isn't typically some of the lower paying jobs for unskilled, that you actually start to see their curiosity about a whole host of possibilities, which is what technology opens up for them.
Right. Well, I think you're referring to, so this year we launched a program called We Need More, right? Where basically, exactly to your point, we engaged a lot of actors, entertainers, and athletes who, I think many kids, right, admire. But, quite frankly, the pyramid to become a LeBron James, right, or a great singer or a great actor, right, that's a really steep climb. And most people don't have that kind of talent. But, if you look at, over the next 5 years or so, the jobs, they all have a technology component associated with them. They all have an entrepreneurship component associated with them. And how can we make those jobs as sexy to these kids so that they're willing, to really engage in their education to be prepared, right? Obviously, it's good for them, it's good for their family, it's good for their communities, it's good for our economy.
You mentioned a couple of times earlier in our conversation about an issue, access, education, and one of the first things you did was let's go talk to people and get informed about it, which brings up the issue of stakeholder engagement. And so is there a process in place at Verizon, a formal process? How do you engage with stakeholders?
So I think it depends on the issue. There are multiple ways that we do it. I referenced, so our policy organization, one of the ways that they do it is through this consumer advisory board that we have, right? So they've got these, heads of these large national nonprofit organizations, and they provide us feedback on different issues, right? So they may talk to us about immigration reform or tax reform, or they may talk to us about the digital divide and where we're rolling out services and where we're not. So that's an important way for us to get feedback to bring back to the business. On the education side, this whole issue of the digital divide, I don't know if you saw earlier, late this summer in September, we released a documentary on National Geographic about the digital divide. And in order to do that, we worked with a lot of communities around the country to understand the impact that sort of lack of access is having in some communities. That was an important way for us to understand, well, actually to do a couple things. One, to sort of raise the issue, bring this to light so that, Verizon, as large as we are, right, these issues are, they're national issues. There's no way that one company can address it, right? Quite frankly, the government struggles to address it at the federal, state, and local level. So we want to raise awareness of the issue so that more people, could work in a more collaborative way to address it, because that's what it's going to take. And then it also helped us understand, what could we be doing? We're looking at, over the next 3 years, setting a big, ambitious goal around education. You didn't hear this here, but what we're thinking about is something like, by 2020, we want to help 2 million students get relevant skills for good jobs and entrepreneurship, which is directly tied to SDG number 4 about a quality education. And what we're thinking about there is, right, in underserved middle schools around the country, and there are around 4,000 of them, there are kids that are not going to have economic opportunity and mobility if they don't get the skills that they need to participate in an information economy. So we want to understand what are the challenges that those students are facing, so that, the investment that we make, in the grand scheme of things, is a rounding error in like the national education budget. But we want to have an impact, right? We want to open a door so that a student could end up at a place like this, right? and have the opportunity, to benefit themselves and their family and their community kind of thing. So that stakeholder engagement is really helpful to understand what the issues are and what can we do and what's the role of technology in addressing that.
Can also, as I look at that really aggressive and wonderful goal, which we didn't hear, I always think of Verizon as an amazing partner and partnership. So that kind of stakeholder engagement also could help identify for you who can be your partner, because we all know that the only way that's going to happen is other partnerships. So as I'm listening to you talk, I start to think, well, gee, our students here at Babson do a lot through our faith and service around working with schools, but if we had a way to focus it, we could all be wrapping up into a metric, because we want to be partnering with you in what you're trying to do. So I love that it's a goal. The other thing that I think is really interesting from a U.S. perspective is I think everybody thinks of the digital divide is outside the U.S. There's such a big digital divide in this country. So I really love that you're raising that issue up, because I think if you were to ask a lot of U.S. students or college students, they wouldn't think there's a big digital divide, and it's huge.
Yeah, it is actually. It was interesting through some of the research that we do to measure the impact of our programs. I mean, we're in underserved middle schools. Close to 25% of those students don't have internet access at home.
Yeah.
So the fact that we're providing them with a device and a plan, that's the first time that they're able, to bring that into the home to do homework and so forth. And, you think of us as such a rich country, right? There are people that don't, right? There clearly are, there's economic disparity, right?
So the other thing you just made me think about, putting technology in the hands of middle school kids who might be first generation and their parents aren't that tech savvy. Are you seeing or measuring any of the spillover influence that when a child comes home and it starts to become technologically savvy, that the family actually accelerates their ability to be tech savvy? And is that helping you from a customer as well as a penetration perspective?
So I think in theory it would, right? I at this point we don't have a way to actually quantify that, though.
Okay.
Anecdotally, we've heard this. We've heard parents talk about it, right? I mean, that's why parents are so anxious to, right? I mean, every parent wants the best for their child, right? And that's why they want their schools to participate and their children to get the devices. But I can't prove that to you.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to, but.
A little bit of nuts and bolts question for you, Chris. We talk in the course about the importance of stakeholder engagement. They have to talk to people, they have to listen to them. And so just would love to hear a little bit about the basic operations of how you do that. I mean, you're not traipsing a bunch of people in once a quarter, sitting them down. You're doing it. What's the rhythm? How do you choose who to talk to and when?
So, well, I think, part of it is you try and capitalize on some things that are going on. Our marketing team, right, they talk to consumers on a regular basis with all the different surveys and communications mechanisms that they have there. So, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're using or actually sort of mining some of the data that they have that they're not even using or even thinking about it the way that we think about it. My example of the correlation between trust and value and corporate citizen is an example of that. So there's that piece of it. I think a lot of it is sort of issue specific. We have, like for we have a smart communities business unit. What they'll do is in Boston and in Sacramento, we want to figure out how can we be relevant. So you go in and you talk to the mayor and you talk to the administration in those cities and identify, well, what are the issues that you're having? What are the challenges, so that we can think about what the solutions that we have that might be relevant here. Right now I talked about Boston and Sacramento with traffic issues, right? Safety issues, congestion issues. Those sort of popped, and that's why we're doing those things. In Sacramento, it was it's a sort of an ongoing process whereby, you know, they could identify other things, right? We have issues like some cities are concerned about crime, and you know there are studies that talk about lighting, right, is a big deterrent. If you, especially now, you know, once we get into, you know, past daylight savings time again, and the days become shorter, at night when things get dark, that's when issues happen. You know, if lights are going out, you know, in parks and so forth, they can become a hotbed for crime. Well, I mean, there are IoT solutions that make those lights smarter, so that, you know, a city manager would know when the lights, you know, if lights have burned out, so that they can address that more quickly. You know, unfortunately, there are other solutions around noise that can detect when like the profile of a gunshot, right? It's, you know, if you think about it, we have wireless antennas around the city, and when a noise is detected, they can sort of triangulate where that noise comes from, and they can get that information to the police force so that they can respond more quickly. I mean, there are some cities that are saying that, you know, there's a lot of crime. We want to focus on lighting and, you know, being able to respond more quickly. It's, I think, well, what I think is interesting is, and the reason that we partner with Babson for our IoT for Good initiative is, we're never going to think of all the applications that our technology would be able to deliver. But, you know, the sort of the digital savvy natives that are part of, you know, the Babson curriculum, all I want to do is make them understand that this technology is out there as sort of a platform. They're the ones that are thinking of all the great ideas, and, you know, so it's, I mean, it's sort of a broader form of stakeholder management in that sense, right? They see things in the world that they want to solve, and we want to be, you know, a piece of supporting them do that, because it creates shared value.
Right. Well, the implications of that are pretty interesting for your job and your team's job, because part of stakeholder engagement is the external piece, which everybody typically thinks of. But you said a couple times, well, the marketing team does X, Y, Z, and the investor relations teams needs this. And so it sounds like a big part of your job when it comes to stakeholder engagement is internal as well.
Yes, no, very much so. I think a lot of it is around and working with the communications team around how to message these things, right? We can talk about, you know, we can talk about these solutions in a very, we tend to talk about them in a very sort of tech-centric way, right? How do you make that story more consumer-oriented so that people could understand? They're probably less interested in what the technology is and more interested in the outcome and the value that they get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So if they know that we're doing a smart transportation solution that, you know, can keep bicyclists safe as they're trying to go through a busy intersection in downtown Boston, that's probably going to be of more interest to them than the fact that there's a sensor in the asphalt underneath the street. So.
Well, this has been, from my perspective, I think we've covered good ground.
Yeah, this has been great.
So.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I
and,
appreciate the opportunity. Obviously, this is good for us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it'll open a window for some of your students around the value of our technology. So.
Well, and the
Yeah,
value of your
that's right.
experience. We appreciate your sharing your personal perspective on what the reality is and what some of those theories are. You did a wonderful job bringing the two together. Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
okay. Well, thank you.